What's the scariest story you've ever heard, real or fake? Honestly, the creepiest thing I've ever heard was on here about the chick who went camping by herself out in the Canadian wilderness. And when she got her pictures developed, there were pictures of her sleeping in her sleeping bag. Shit gives me goosebumps. So back in the 1970s, my mom was a teenager living in Houston. She and her 9 siblings lived in the Heights, which she says is a nice neighborhood now, but at the time was something of a slum. Her family was super poor. Anyways, my mom had a crush on one of her brother's friends. She was around 14 or 15 at the time, and he was a few years older, but she was in love. His name was Mark. Well, around this time, boys started disappearing from the neighborhood. They weren't leaving notes or telling anyone that they were leaving. The families were calling the police, but the police weren't doing anything about it. They decided that the boys had run away, and never really looked into it further. After all, these were poor kids living in a bad neighborhood. They ran away all the time. Life goes on. Then one day, Mark disappears too. Meanwhile, my mom's younger brother is hitching a ride out to the beach to go fishing. He did this on a regular basis, and would bum a ride from anyone. On the way to the beach, the guy driving the car stops to fill up the gas tank. The guy working at the gas station, Mom says they call him Weird Larry, sees my uncle and asks who he's with. My uncle replies that he doesn't actually know the guy. Larry won't let my uncle go any further and makes him get out of the car. The driver goes on without him. Now then, 3 years have passed since boys started disappearing, and they finally find out what happened. A man had been paying 2 boys to lure teenage boys to his house, where he drugged them, strapped them to a wooden board, tortured them, raped them, and killed them. There were at least 28 victims, and Mark Scott was one of them. The only reason they found out was because the 2 teenagers murdered the serial killer, then told the police about all of the murders, and led them to some of the bodies. And guess who picked up my uncle that day he was going fishing? About 10 years ago, I was recently divorced and living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment. The place was clean and the rent was decent. One of those places that had a doorman. I felt safe here. I was alone and loving it, focused on my career and not on my clingy ex-husband. Things were finally looking up for me. At the time, I was working pretty late at the office and would often stumble into my apartment, sleep-deprived, in the early hours of the morning and wake up by 6:30, 7-ish to start the day. I started noticing that in the morning, my door would be unlocked sometimes. I usually dismissed this as my sleepy dead brain thinking that the bed looked more appealing than locking the door. Another thing that I noticed since moving in was that I seemed to misplace things more than I used to. Little things, like a hairbrush or nail polish, that sort of thing. It wasn't really that big of a deal, just enough to be a slight annoyance in my day. The longer I lived there, the more frequently I seemed to forget to lock the door. At first, it was every once in a while. Then, it seemed like an almost daily occurrence. More things went missing, things like pictures, shaving razors, and most disturbingly, my underwear. This went on for long enough that I started to get a little paranoid. I started to take the time at night to make sure the door was locked. I got into a habit of every night after I locked the door to turn the handle 3 times and say to myself, "It's locked, it's locked, it's locked." Time after time, I would wake up and the door would be unlocked. One time, I even tried staying up all night to watch the door, but I ended up falling asleep in my chair. I decided that my mind was not reliable enough to stay up all night, so I invested in a video camera. I went all out and bought the fanciest camera that I could get my hands on. So one night, I set up the camera facing the door. I hid the camera under a pile of towels on the floor. I locked the door and went to bed. When I woke up, my apartment looked normal, nothing missing that I could see. I decided to check the tape. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage, not seeing anything. I was just about to give up when I noticed the handle of the door jitter. Then, it slowly crept open. A figure slid through the half-opened door and walked towards the camera. It paused, looked around as if it was listening for something, then walked forward into direct view of the camera. I paused. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck started to rise. I was staring directly into the face of the maintenance man of the building. I could see those big, thick glasses and curly hair. I had no doubt who it was. I played the tape a little more. He looked comfortable as he walked around the apartment. Then he turned and walked towards my bedroom and out of the view of the camera. I didn't know what to do. Sobbing, I called the police. I tried to explain over the phone, but couldn't. Soon enough, 2 officers arrived at my doorstep. I told them everything and showed them the tape. I remember seeing the blood drain from their faces. They promised me that I was safe and that they were going to get this guy. I needed to lay down, but didn't want to be alone. One of the officers offered to stand outside my apartment door as I took a nap. I was laying in bed, unable to sleep, but too drained to move. Something kept nagging at me. I laid there for a few minutes, tossing and turning, unable to get comfortable or rest. My mind was racing. Then a realization slowly washed over me and chilled me to the bone. We watched the tape and saw the man enter my home, but we never saw him leave. I froze, then started shaking. I needed to get to the front door. I sat up and looked around the room. I couldn't see anyone. I swung my legs over the side of the bed cautiously. My feet hit the cold wood floor, and I felt warm breath on my ankles. I raced out of my apartment as fast as I could and to the safety of the police officer. He called for backup. They found the man under my bed, clutching a knife and a Polaroid camera. A girl in her teens gets called upon to babysit some kids on a Friday evening. Apparently she watches those 2 girls pretty regularly. Anyway, the parents leave for the evening and said they wouldn't be home until around midnight. The teenager puts the 2 girls to bed around 9 p.m. She does what most people would do, goes downstairs and watches TV for a while. She watches TV for an hour or so, and by this point it's getting pretty late. She's in the living room on the main level. The TV sits in the corner of the room, with large windows on either side of it. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she sees what she thinks is someone walking by the window outside through the bushes. Naturally, she gets pretty freaked out. She ends up calling 911, and the police arrive. The police check outside and don't find any signs of anyone walking around. It was winter with snow on the ground. The police officers assure her she's safe and that the lighting from both the TV and the lamp probably played tricks on her by reflecting off the window. The teen agrees that's probably what it was, yet asks them to check inside the house for her just to be safe. The police reluctantly oblige and start randomly checking rooms, closets, and the garage a bit haphazardly. They roll their eyes a bit as they wonder how much this girl's imagination has run wild. Well, it turns out they find a man hiding underneath one of the little girl's beds. I guess as the story goes, it was the little girl's mother's ex-husband. The babysitter didn't see someone walk past the window outside. What she saw was his reflection walking behind the couch. A man is driving a regular route along the highway when he notices a turnoff that will take him up through the mountains. He figures he drives this way all the time, but has never taken the mountain path, even though it will only take him a few hours longer to reach his destination. As a spur-of-the-moment decision, he takes the turn and begins his journey up the winding road. He'd started his drive later in the day than usual, so the sky is getting dark as he approaches the top, but the view is gorgeous. While he continues, he gets a small chill up the base of his neck, but dismisses it as the cool mountain air. Not long after, he has to slow his car as he approaches what appears to be a nasty car accident. 2 cars completely totaled, looking like they hit each other head-on just after rounding a corner. The man can see a few bodies on the ground, all bloodied and not moving. Immediately he knows he has to pull over and help, but he can't stop some 6th sense telling him something about the scene is wrong, like it isn't natural. He decides he's going to drive his car forward and park it just beyond the crash site before getting out to help. He slowly creeps by the wreckage and manages to get a better look at one of the bodies. It's definitely human, but something seems amiss, but he still can't place it. He rolls the car forward maybe 6 meters from the crash site. As he's about to come to a stop and open his door to investigate, he looks out his front windshield for just a moment. It's gotten terribly dark now, nearly pitch black, when something in his rearview mirror catches his eye. Several somethings, in fact. As he gazes into the mirror in horror, he can see the bodies of the crash site illuminated by his rear lights. All of them are sitting up, staring directly at his car, eyes like glowing orbs in the mirror. He panics as suddenly more people come out from the ditches and forests surrounding the road, but only when the crash victim bodies begin to stand, seemingly fine with no limps or dragging, does he have the presence of mind to throw the car back into drive. By the time the first people are taking careful steps toward his vehicle, he's already speeding as fast as he can around the bend and getting the hell off the mountain. Nothing ever came for him, nor did it seem he was ever followed. Sometimes he wonders if his mind played a trick on him, but still to this day, he always checks his rearview mirror before ever stepping out of the car. The Lake Bodum murders were an infamous multiple homicide that took place in Finland in 1960. Lake Bodum is a lake by the city of Espoo, about 22 kilometers west of the country's capital, Helsinki. In the early hours of June 5, 1960, 4 teenagers were camping on the shores of Lake Bodum. Between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., an unknown person or people murdered 3 of them with a knife and blunt instrument, wounding the 4th. The sole survivor, Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson, led a normal life until 2004, when he became a suspect and was subsequently charged. In October 2005, a district court found Gustafsson not guilty of all charges against him. The murders have proven to be a popular subject in the Finnish media and commonly return to the headlines whenever new information or theories surface, but the case is still unsolved and will probably always remain a mystery. This story was told to me by my great aunt. In Cuba, where we're all from, the summers tend to get hot. Coupled with the lack of air conditioning, you'd have to be wealthy to own a unit, people tend to sleep with doors and windows open. One night, my Aunt T was putting her grandchildren to sleep. She laid in bed with them, and they were alone in the home. One of her sisters, Berta, was supposed to be keeping them company tonight, but some last-minute event made her change where she slept that night. My Aunt T says that sometime around 9 p.m., she noticed a figure who, by her description, must have been 7 feet tall. It was human-shaped, but seemed to float inside of their home. If it had legs, they weren't visible, because a long robe of some sort covered them and dragged along her floor. At this point, rather than scream in fear, my Aunt T decides to lay perfectly still so as not to wake the children. She sees the figure cross the hallway and head into her room, looming ominously over them. The face she described was that of a pale woman, with big red lips and her hair in dreads, like that of a Rastafarian man. There were just shadows, cavities as she called it, where her eyes would have been. It left her room through the same way it entered, but didn't leave. My aunt's house is large, and she swears she saw the figure go in and out of each room, take about the same amount of time, then leave. Eventually she ran out of places in the home to visit, and simply glided out the front door. My aunt cries this very day, because the next morning her sister Berta was found dead. Everyone thought it must have been some sort of heart attack or stroke in her sleep, because no one heard anything, and they found her dead where she had laid the night before, only lifeless. My aunt swears the thing must have been death itself, searching for her sister where she was supposed to be. This story was told to me by my aunt. Apologies for any lack of detail, as my grandmother died years before I was born. And also, I don't know how true this is. First off, my mother was one of 10 children. When she was a teen, her parents and half her siblings moved to the east. My aunts and uncles have told me that something was strange around that house. They would hear voices, running upstairs when no one was there, A rocking chair would rock when no one was in it, and so on. Eventually, my grandmother was diagnosed with brain cancer. She was in her bed at home recuperating from her most recent surgery, and my aunt was there alone taking care of her. My grandmother was completely bedbound at this point. It was impossible for her to walk. She had a funny tendency to blot at her healing incisions on her scalp with tissues, which is kinda not so great for them. Because of this, the tissue box was kept across the room from her bed. My aunt brought in my grandmother's lunch on a tray and set it down on my grandmother's lap. My grandmother asked her for the tissues for her head, and my aunt reminded her that she was not supposed to do that. My grandmother then asked for a drink. My aunt went to the kitchen and brought back her drink when she sees her mother with the tissues, still in bed, blotting her head. My aunt takes them away and again reminds her that she shouldn't do that. This is when she realizes that my grandmother can't get out of bed, so she asks, "Mom, how did you even get these?" My grandmother replied, "Oh, that little girl that always follows you around gave them to me." This happened to me, and it still freaks me out when I'm home alone. When I was 16 a few summers ago, my parents went out for the day, and my sister left to go out too. I live in an average small suburban neighborhood. I was stuck in the house, bored with my dog with nobody else home. It was really hot in the living room, so I turned on the air conditioner. For that to happen, I need to open the garage door, because the butt of the air conditioner faces in there, and the garage gets overheated. Usually when we do this, we lock the garage door that leads into the living room. But this one time, I forgot. I sat down on the bed in my room and relaxed, not thinking much of it. Bad idea. A few hours later in the living room, I hear my dog barking like a maniac. I almost ignored it, but went into the living room and heard the doorknob on the garage door jiggling. I assumed that my sister came home, so I yelled, "It's not locked." She didn't respond back. The doorknob jiggled more violently. I walked in and went to the door, yelling again, "It's not locked," when the door opened. It felt like slow motion. The door creaked open a sliver of a crack, and that's all I needed to see. I just saw the feet. Huge, dark brown hiking boots of a man. Not my sister. I immediately pushed on the door to close it again and started screaming and crying hysterically. I'm a small girl, but I struggled to push it shut and locked it. He started pounding on the door, but then it stopped. Hysterically crying and screaming, I scooped up my dog and ran into the kitchen to get a knife. When I went in the kitchen, I heard the gate in the backyard open and quick footsteps down the cement path. Like in the horror movies, with tears streaming down my face, I screamed no. Dog in one hand and knife in the other, I threw the knife on the floor and ran to lock the back door. When I quickly bent down on the kitchen floor to pick up the knife, my legs were shaking from being so scared. My legs gave out, and I fell forward almost onto my face. I tried to scramble to my feet, but ended up crawling and tripping on the kitchen floor, and I accidentally scratched a long, shallow cut on my bare foot with the knife. I hid under the dining room table and said my prayers. I thought this was it. This is how I'm going to die. Here in the quiet, empty house with my dog as the only witness. I held my mouth to cover my crying when I heard footsteps approach the back door. My heart was racing a million beats a minute, and I had the knife tightly clenched in my hand as I waited for him to make his next move. I saw his shadow through the blinds looking into the window. He stood there for a while and then walked out. The police never found him. To this day, I always make sure the door is locked when the garage door is open. I don't know what would have happened if my dog didn't bark and alert me that there was a man trying to break in. I would have been in my room, completely unaware, until it was too late.